Brilliant. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to another stellar panel event by the Conservative Environment Network, this time entitled Why Do We Bother When We're Just 1%? How the UK Can Lead the World on Climate Change. This is the, I think, 12th of our 21 events. We've got a packed events plan and programme over today, the rest of today and the whole of tomorrow. So I think there's some leaflets still floating around. You go to our stand to find out more, to sign up for free as a supporter and get all sorts of benefits that way, or chat to one of the very tired members of the SEN team that's sitting around the room, often flagging at the back somewhere. Huge thanks to Associated British Ports, ABP, for sponsoring this event, their generosity in doing so. I'm delighted to be joined by, as I say, a stellar panel. So I'm joined by Dr. Frank Luntz, a American Republican pollster extraordinaire, Louie French, the Member of Parliament for Old Bexley and Sidcup, and a member of the SEN Caucus, Bernice, the Research Director of Futures, Fellow for Sustainability and Chair of the Sustainability Accelerator Advisory Board at Chatham House, Eamonn Ives, the Head of Research at the Entrepreneurs Network, bit of a mouthful, sorry, and former Special Advisor to COP26 President Alok Sharma, and Julian Walker, the Chief Commercial Officer of ABP. Thank you all very much for joining me. I'm going to ask the panel for some short opening remarks. I know Frank has to leave early, so I will go to him first. And then do please get thinking of some questions, and we'll head over to you afterwards. Frank, if you'd like to start, we'd love to hear from you.
So first, I have to acknowledge that this is one area where you are so far ahead of America that it's really impressive. That you all, it's not a question now of if, but a question of when. And that is due to a great degree what this organization has done. I don't give out compliments. If those of you who've been following me, I'm getting my ass kicked because I've been challenging some of the status quo. In this case, you are brilliant in your advocacy. You are brilliant in your communication. You have won the right of center over. The truth is, you're more likely to have opponents in the Labour Party than you are in the Conservative Party, and I'm shocked at that. But it's from the North. It's from people whose livelihoods depend on the old-fashioned, or they think it depends on the old-fashioned energy resources. So, and by the way, one of the reasons why you've lost some votes to the Lib Dems is in suburban areas in the South and in the Midlands is because you are making the case so effectively for why this is a crisis. And I want to make a couple points to you. First is that when you talk about the economy versus the environment, by 75 to 25, the public, British public, prioritizes the economy over the environment. But the moment that you change it to a clean, safe, healthy environment versus a healthy economy, so it's parallel, by 10 points, the public prioritizes a clean, safe, healthy environment, which is why I have to ask you to stop saying sustainability, because sustainability is the status quo. If something is sustainable, it means it will be there 50 years, 100 years from now. But if you advocate for cleaner, safer, healthier, you're advocating for better. So please make that change. Second, to my shock, and this will either get ooze or ahs or annoyance, in America, the best visual that we have to promote a cleaner, safer, healthier environment is a child, is a baby, cradling the world. The best visual over here, and I would put it up if we had the ability to do so, is a deer or some sort of animal. And so I've come to realize from testing the visuals that Americans prioritize children and animals are only okay. And you guys don't particularly like children, but you really love animals. So, and I tell this as a joke, but it is actually true. Third is that the objective here is still to maintain a reliable and dependable infrastructure. So it is not that you're hostile to a 21st century modernization or that you're seeking a different approach. In the end, reliable and dependable can live with a cleaner, safer, healthier environment. Fourth is that you got to prioritize China. There's no way to get, I'm only going to do 5. That there's no way to ignore the China challenge, and that you shouldn't do it. That in the end, the British public wants us all to do so together. And the phrase is working together side by side, which could be either party conference. But working together side by side, we can get done A, we can do B, we can do C, D, E, working together side by side. And finally, and this is my criticism, they never ever should have been pledges at COP26. And you should be outraged. This was presented to this government, it was presented to my government. Do not say a pledge, because a pledge is an effort. A commitment is a guarantee. If you make a pledge, that just says you're going to try. A commitment says you're going to do. And I begin with this because these are specific language findings that is going to make it possible for you all to succeed politically and based on policy. And that's what this is all about. It's not one or the other. And it's a privilege to be here, and I actually attempted to work my way out of this panel, as Sam knows, but I can't say no to him. So hopefully this is specific ideas for you to take forward. Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much, Frank. And if our other panelists will excuse me, given you've got to leave early, I'll just follow up with one question for you, if I may. Anyone who's worked on the environment in the UK will have heard the argument. There's a theme for this panel. You know, why should we bother when we're 1% of emissions? China's not going to bother. India's not going to bother. Russia's not going to bother. You know, how much difference can we actually make? And I've got American colleagues, particularly on the Republican side, who say, well, why should America bother? Now, America is, I think, something like 14% of global emissions. What's your sense of how to deal with that argument with Americans? You know, what's going to motivate them to think this is something worth doing, with or without China's role?
Okay, so, and I can actually answer that specifically because we did the polling of the US and the UK, and we are different. We have different priorities, and the messaging has to be different. Here, because you already believe in it, but there is still, and it's not that they're skeptical, but as you say, they don't want to act. You need to start with the consequences first, then you go to the positive, which is what they've been doing here, and then you go back to the negative. And the US is exactly the opposite. What are the consequences? What is the threat of failure? You start there. Then you turn it around to the positive, and the reason why is you're trying to connect to them from word one. And the truth is, I always start with a joke, but I'm so tired right now, and I don't want to fall over because it would be really embarrassing, that there's nothing funny. Actually, do you guys know what Bernie Sanders is? Yeah. I wanted to be Secretary of Agriculture in a Bernie Sanders administration so that I'd be the one to plant those magic trees where all the free shit grows from. That's the best I can do.
Well, no, thank you very much, Frank. A real tour de force, certainly, of the polling and political arguments.
2 more.
Oh, actually, exciting. Apologies, I spoke too soon.
These are not jokes. That you're an island country. You want people to act even despite what's happening with China. You remind them of the floods and rising sea levels because that impacts so many millions of Brits, and that is the visualization of failure. Third is that if we want a global commitment in the end, why shouldn't Britain lead? And I would ask it as a question, not a statement. Why shouldn't Britain be first? Why shouldn't Britain create the jobs? Why shouldn't Britain get the benefits? I was listening yesterday to the politicians, and all I would have changed with them is the questions. Why not us for the future? And it's time for action. Get it done. No more excuses. The British sentiment, which is what makes me so proud to be here, is a direct approach that if we have to do it, even if we're going to get our hands dirty, we just do it. This has been part of the British culture now for centuries. You don't complain, you don't ask for credit, you just get it done. It's the sensible approach. So time for action, get it done, no more excuses, in that order. And that's what brings people to want to act, even if China does nothing.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Frank. Well, I'll turn now to Louie. I mean, you've not been an MP for a very long time, but I'm sure you've probably heard this argument already about why should we bother. What's your answer?
Well, thank you. It's great to be here this afternoon, and as the chairman just said, I've not been an MP for that long. It's been an eventful 10 months, to say the least, in my political career. But previous to being in the House as the MP for Old Bexon Sidcup, which is a great privilege, I actually was a sustainability fund manager in the city. So I know a thing or two about sustainability and the UK's role on a kind of global basis. And just touching on what Frank said in some of his comments, I think it's quite interesting when you listen to the arguments coming out of the US and friends and colleagues and businesses that we speak with. I remember at the start of my career in the city, you would try and speak to American investors about sustainability and other issues, and you would pretty much be laughed out of the room by asking such questions. But now, at the point when I left the city, this was front and centre of the audience that you would speak to in the US, who, like Frank just said, kind of realised that they were so far behind Britain in its role in leading the argument here. So I would argue that, it's very strongly, we've got a moral duty. Frank touched upon kind of protecting our own interests from an environmental point of view on flooding, etc., as an island nation. But I'd also argue very strongly we've got a huge economic opportunity. And I think some of the comments coming out of the Labour Party conference last week, as you'd expect me to say, we're a bit behind the curve. I think we are already leading the green industrial revolution in this country. Before this panel, I was asked to focus on the finance and the city role, because obviously that's my background. But I think if you look across the breadth of this country, I think we are leading that, and the vast majority of the British public are on that journey with us. Frank talks about kind of moving on from pledges to commitments. And the most obvious one from the UK's perspective is obviously being the first country to legislate towards net zero by 2050. And I remember at the time when that commitment was being made, I thought, wow, this is a big one, and I'm not sure the politicians have thought this fully through to what these commitments mean. But actually, I think in terms of showing that kind of global leadership, I think the UK has been much further advanced than other countries. And through our presidency, brilliantly done by Alec, you've seen other countries follow suit and commit to that. So I think there's a huge opportunity for the UK to lead here. I think we have a moral duty to do so, whether that's in kind of buying power and trade, the role of our aid and how we commit aid internationally, but also through financial services. And some of that work that's going on in the city is huge. We have a massive opportunity to promote the British economy, not just financial services, but other sectors such as renewables, and actually to grow international trade with a UK filter amongst democratic nations to improve that. So there's a huge opportunity, and I think that's why we have to lead. It's not just about emissions coming out of this country.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Louie. Bernice, if I can turn to you next. You're an expert on trade, on China, obviously a huge perspective on this, so please, it'd be good to hear from you.
Well, thank you. I kind of feel that, coming after Frank and Lou, that actually a lot of good lines have been had, really, which is indeed that why not, right? And the starting point from both of them is indeed that it makes economic sense, it makes political sense, it makes sense from a health perspective, but perhaps more importantly, if we are to solve this problem, which is not really about solving it for ourselves only, but for the rest of the world, because upon which we all depend, it is important that we have a maximalist view in terms of what needs to be done. At the same time, understanding that we probably can't do it all holding hands at the same time, but we can definitely do it side by side, as Frank said, in parallel play mode, where we can find the best way we can help in terms of contributing to this particular challenge. Now, it's boring to talk about challenges, much more interesting to think about future opportunities. As Lou and also Frank already mentioned, of course it is about being able to capture the benefits from the next generation of growth opportunities, whether from a business perspective or from a political perspective or from people's perspective. There are all these possibilities that are currently there, that we know are there, but yet at the same time not really materialized yet, especially from the perspective of supply chains and trade. Now, this is where I think it's particularly interesting from a UK perspective, which is that in some ways trade is a weird thing, right? Obviously you need to be big to have power, but at the same time if you're too big, you don't really bother. If you're too small, nobody cares about you. But in that sense, we're kind of almost perfectly sized in the sense that we're big enough, but not too big. And therefore, it is possible, actually, if indeed one chooses to politically to invest in it, to look at how best, in fact, to use this trading power that we have so far, and with the perfectly sized economy that we have in that sense, to help figure out how best, and we did see some of this happening via COP26 around, for example, deforestation-free supply chain, where the UK uses market power in a very strategic way to help figure out some conversations around that, which is extremely interesting. We can do that again in different kinds of renewable energy development. We can do that again in many different ways through which future solutions have to be found. We often talk about friendshoring, and I read the Financial Times and see Polita Clark at the front here, and they tell us that friendshoring isn't happening yet. And nonetheless, there's a lot of talk about it, but the reality is a lot of figuring out how to make sure that we reduce dependencies and have a sustainable or safer, healthier, better supply chains for the future is going to be, in fact, part of the future challenge. And the UK could be in a very good place together with others to help figure out what does it look like to have a sustainable, safer, healthier, better, I'm going to use the language that Frank justifies now, supply chain in such a way that will indeed get us to a leadership role. And that means that we are going for maximalism, bearing in mind that it doesn't mean hand-holding, but it does mean being able to play a really big part in the world of parallel play, in some sense even parallel play moving forward together, without which we know that we won't be able to solve the problem that we're increasingly seeing now, not just as something in the future, but a lived experience. We talked about impacts. The lived experience is going to be about impacts. The lived experience is going to be about understanding the return to investments. And the real world of businesses are already telling us all the signal that actually the businesses are moving, the global economy is moving in that direction. And the lived experience is going to be both about negative impacts as well as increasingly what brings return are going to be the cleaner, safer, more secure options. So with that in mind, I think that it's pretty clear why is it that it's not really an option not to think about why not to lead.
Brilliant, thank you very much. I'm going to turn to Eamonn next. Eamonn, you've been until very recently closer to the politics of this question probably than anybody else. So yeah, delighted to hear your thoughts.
Thank you, John, and great to hear the thoughts that we've had already. I'm going to, I think, keep my remarks quite short because I always think it's more interesting to hear from the audience and the questions that they might have. But weighing in, I think there's so many different kind of dynamics when we think about climate and how it sort of intersects with the international question. Trade, obviously massive, and I think I'll focus on that because that's what you've asked me to focus on. Trade there's a lot of kind of misconceptions around trade and the environment, and certainly in work I've done in the past, supported generously by Sen, we looked at sort of what the UK could be doing on this front, and I think to its credit, it has made some steps forward. Coming out of the European Union, there was some quite rapid trade liberalisation on green goods. I think we still need to see more on green services and a few questions around regulatory alignment on particular things. So electric vehicles would be an obvious example there. Potentially some trade frictions coming down the line. In terms of what more the UK could do, though, I think one thing that's worth touching on now, and hopefully we can talk about it a little bit later, is the idea of carbon border adjustment mechanisms. Some people in the audience might be aware of these. Essentially trying to levelise the price of carbon in terms of what producers in the UK might have to face, and then what producers externally might not have to face. I think there's a very good argument that mechanisms like these ought to be brought in really to ensure that the rest of the world is fulfilling its obligations as we see them, and not and then sort of climate change isn't just being sort of led by a narrow group of countries. Of course, you can talk about equity issues and things like that. But I think these mechanisms are coming. The EU has done a lot of work on them already. I think the UK has committed to be doing more on them, but I think the picture's gone quite quiet on that. And we might expect some more things to be coming in the next weeks or months. But yeah, maybe I'll just sort of park it there. I think there's so many different interesting dynamics, and I'd be interested to hear sort of questions from the audience on those specifics.
Brilliant. Well, I can promise we'll get to those questions very, very soon. And last and by no means least, I'll hand over to Julian from ABP. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. Just to give it context, so ABP is a UK leading port operator. We run 21 ports around the UK. So I'm going to bring a sort of business perspective on the discussion so far. Reinforcing the point, there's obviously a moral obligation that we all have to deliver climate, measures to stop the climate change that's happening. But if we look at it from a business perspective, the UK is already doing a lot. We talked about legislation of net zero as the first country of doing that. But if we look at something like offshore wind, which is going to be fundamental for decarbonising electricity generation, the UK leads that. So there's a lot of work that's been done already. The other aspects that I think are really important to bring to the fore is actually listening to what is the Conservative policy at the moment when we talk about energy security, we talk about the energy transition, we talk about levelling up, and obviously achieving that net zero 2050. And the UK has some unique attributes to be able to lead on that. So I've talked about the offshore wind. The next key thing is obviously hydrogen. And this is an area that we as a country are already moving forward with in terms of producing the technology, but also the storage capabilities of doing that and decarbonising our supply chain. Perhaps probably one of the most interesting ones is the decarbonisation aspect, so carbon capture. And again, that's something that the UK has made strides in already. There are two clusters that have been worked on, so the East Coast Cluster and HyNet off the Irish Sea. And essentially that's capturing carbon dioxide that's produced during industrial processes and then storing it underneath the gas caverns and the saline aquifers off our coastlines. Now that's, to a certain extent, has been thought about how do we decarbonise the UK. But if we take a step back and look at it from a trading opportunity, and I think this is the point around bridging supply chain and trade with what's happening already. So the UK, through the geological attributes that it has as an island, but also the gas caverns and saline aquifers we have off the coastline, can essentially store a huge amount of CO2, more than we produce in this country. So from a trading aspect, if you compare ourselves to the EU, we can import CO2, so this comes back to the carbon pricing and the trade issue, and store that CO2 that's being produced in places like the EU. So it makes good sense from a business aspect. I think the other key area that the UK is also leading, I talked about offshore wind from the perspective of the North Sea, is also what's happening down in the Celtic Sea. So you may be aware, in the North Sea it's very much fixed bottom, as they refer to it, turbines, and moving from fixed bottom to floating. So fixed bottom turbines require a depth up to about 60 metres. Beyond that, you need to go to floating. So if you look at it from a global perspective, obviously there are only certain areas that those fixed bottom turbines are going to work. So the work that's been done and the research, etc., in large-scale floating offshore wind that will start off in the Celtic Sea and ScotWind around the Scottish coastline, again will be technology and that's scalable but also transferable. And I think, again, just to give it sort of context in terms of where we as the UK sit, our American colleagues who operate ports have been in contact, wanting to understand, from a port infrastructure perspective, what do they need? So, my message in very simple terms is it makes very good business sense. I think it's critical from the UK's policy perspective in terms of UK energy security and the net zero transition. But it's just leveraging off what we've done already and actually putting the policy measures in place that drive that change.
Brilliant, thank you very much. I'm going to come to the audience in one moment. I'm going to briefly abuse my position as chair to just follow up with one question for at least a couple of the panel. When we're looking at high emitters, China, India, the US being, I think, the biggest three, Eamonn's touched upon some of the sticks we could use in terms of carbon border adjustments, although I'm sure the Americans would certainly hope to be exempted from that if we move to it. But where do you draw the balance on the question of the carrots and the sticks? I mean, does peer pressure work, or should we be looking at that sort of thing? Bernice, maybe I'll come to you first on that.
Well, I just want to kind of quickly talk about, well, actually, if you look at sort of the big picture, obviously, we add it all up. We don't really add them up yet. But the big four that you mentioned, we're not necessarily doing really, really badly. The Rhodian group, I think, said that Biden's IRA climate plans about 32 to 42% greenhouse gas emissions cuts on 2005 level. There's room to improve. It's not too bad. EU is going to getting 55%. India vastly overachieving on solar and positive on coal use declining by 2030. Even in China that we talked about as if nothing happened, 97% of the economy is under some kind of emissions peaking plan already. So in some sense, I mean, there is movement afoot. Now, so the question then is whether or not it is possible to make sure that all of these are moving together in such a way that also make sure that those who are actual laggards beyond these big guys are actually going to come forward. And I think that's where all the discussion so far in terms of different incentive systems becomes interesting, because I have always been historically less fond of, until recently, of questions around border and carbon adjustment on the basis that I kind of felt that the politics of it is so toxic that, by the time you pay off all your protectionists, you can't really have an environmentally sound design. But the EU is showing that possibly you can do it. And if indeed they could do it, and therefore it would make sense to really think through the role the UK could therefore play as a non-ginormous or the mega country who could actually think through what that really means for the rest of the world. So I kind of think that this is being able to help lead on the policy debate, which we're pretty good at pontificating here, on terms of the pros and cons, may indeed be one such area where we can think through some of the carrots and sticks questions.
Brilliant. Would any of the other panellists like to pontificate on this particular question, or shall I go to the audience? Brilliant. Well, over to you. I'll take, I don't know who's got the microphone Jack has there. I'll take 3 questions. So I'll take the gentleman at the front here first, please.
Good afternoon, Councillor Bob Wade. I'm really asking as an engineer rather than as a councillor. One of the big problems I found, I did a lot of Anglo-American programs, and the Brits are known as clever little beggars. And we're very good at designing things. We're pretty useless investing after that. The danger is that, America and the rest of the world may be behind us, but how much attention is going to be paid on IPR? Because the danger is we'll come up with the brilliant ideas, but we just give it away.
Thank you. And then in the blue dress, I think, in the middle here. Thank you. Just there, yeah.
It's purple.
Sorry, blue. I'm going mad. I'm going to pretend I'm colourblind.
Kira Box from Friends of the Earth. I just wondered, successive governments have, for fairly obvious reasons, been quite keen to talk about territorial emissions rather than extraterritorial emissions when discussing how well they've done at decreasing the UK's climate impact. So I wonder how the panel think that the UK might more effectively talk about its global footprint, the impact of UK investment abroad, and use that to demonstrate that our complicity and maybe our impact in climate change is somewhat larger than governments might have been telling us for a while.
Thank you. One more, I'll go to the gentleman just there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. John Blundell from Coventry. In view of what you say, should we forget about fracking and I think there's some reference to it, and instead concentrate on modular nuclear, mini-nuclear power stations, the mobile ones I'm talking about? Thank you.
Thank you. I'll take all of those questions in one go. Louie, maybe I'll come to you first. I know if you wanted to think about this designing versus investing point. How do we make sure that we're keeping the whole of supply chains, or as much as we possibly can, in the UK?
I think that's a really, really important point. I think if we look at some of the issues in China over the years, I can think about Dyson and probably a few other examples, which is probably front and centre of your mind. I think there is that really important point around kind of protections from a legal point of view in terms of design of products that I think we should always be very conscious of and looking at. I mean, what we've seen, again, from some of my experience in the city is it's winning hearts and minds over at times. I think because if you speak to, whether it's a business or a household, who may not be particularly passionate about the environment, shall we say, but if you can prove that there's significant efficiencies that they can drive in their kind of underlying revenue stream, you suddenly win that argument over. And I've seen this in big, traditional, dirty energy producing firms and sectors where they've won that based on bottom line. And I think you're right about the protection. So we are good at designing things, but we do have to make sure in certain countries and jurisdictions that the protections are correct from a legal point of view. What was the second question? Because I've forgotten that already.
Territorial emissions versus extraterritorial emissions.
Yeah, this is a really, really interesting point. And actually, when I look at this, I think most people in the room might be aware that obviously UK-listed companies are expected via new disclosure regulations to disclose kind of net emissions and other targets by 2023. And I'm watching this very closely as someone who had to try and digest a lot of this data previously when looking at different companies about how people achieve Scope 3 emission calculations. I think this is going to be a very interesting area to look at from a domestic production, but also how that affects international and the kind of the rest of the supply chain. Looking very closely, I don't have all the answers at this point, but I think you're right that this is one planet. We are one country on that planet, but we do need to be looking at the whole picture from a UK and global point of view. We're not doing this in isolation in any way, shape or form, which is, again, back to the original point around UK leadership, is to take people on that journey with us. And then lastly on fracking, that's a really interesting question. And, constituents in Old Bexley and Sidcup have asked me this question quite a lot over the last week or so. You know, it's an interesting. I think if you look at what the government is saying, they want more of everything to an extent. So I think this is all about UK energy security, and I think given what's going on in certain parts of the world, I think that's understandable why the government are looking at that. But I think we mustn't forget that we're also looking at more nuclear, more of those kind of small modular reactors from the likes of Rolls-Royce and others, looking at that kind of the ban on onshore wind being removed. So there's a lot of positive in there, and actually I think we shouldn't lose sight of the bigger picture about, you know, the ambition and expectation for the UK's electricity to be all low carbon, or 95% of it by 2030. So I look at the bigger picture around kind of the direction of travel we're in. As we touched on, we've been leading the world on offshore wind. I remember many, many years ago, people saying, well, why would we want wind energy? And then we had the Green Investment Bank at the time and others, and it unlocked so much private capital into the renewable sphere. My personal interest currently is not just around renewables, it's that energy efficiency part of the picture. And I think you have to look at some of the work that we need to do around National Grid and others to make sure that this, you know, whether it's electric cars or other issues, that we actually solve that from an engineering point of view and from an efficiency point of view to make this all work.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm going to come to Julian next, if I may. Julian, I wonder if you particularly look at the gentleman's question at the front here about how we make sure we're keeping that expertise in the UK and we're not offshoring our emissions, but also actually the economic opportunities from decarbonisation as well.
No, definitely. And I'm going to use offshore wind again, if I may, so forgive me. But the offshore wind that's been developed in the North Sea, it's a great example of where we've done a fantastic job as a country of putting that offshore wind in, so putting the capacity in. What we didn't do very well was secure the manufacturing and the opportunities that went with that. So there are basically two OEMs, so equipment manufacturers in the UK building blades. Everything else comes from overseas. And that's recognised by government. So the next CFD process is a contract for different processes. They look at the national content. So that's one of the key criteria that bidders will be judged against. So the UK is very much looking at 60% national content for other projects going forward. So making sure that we stick to that is fundamental. So coming back, you know, as I mentioned earlier on, the opportunity around floating offshore wind, either with ScotWind or in South Wales and the Celtic Sea, again, you know, we've got another opportunity to do this. And I know that's, well, I'm fairly sure that's well recognised within BEIS, because certainly the discussions that we have is that you know, government is very conscious that they want to secure, you know, their entire sort of economic supply chain benefit from, you know, the investment that's going into the offshore wind. So, you know, there are good examples where that's working, and it will be the same with the CCUS, so the carbon capture and storage, the same with the hydrogen economy. So where we're putting CFDs, contract for different processes, in to drive that minimum pricing, so people invest in it, and the technology development that will come from that. It's about securing that UK content to ensure as a country we benefit from the economic, you know, drivers that brings.
Thank you, Julian. Eamonn, I wondered if you might take the fracking versus SMRs point based on some of your research, and then I'll go to Bernice on the territorial emissions question.
Yeah, so fracking's obviously opened itself up as an issue for us to think about again, if indeed it ever went away. I don't really have strident views either way. I'm a big supporter of modular nuclear reactors if we can get them down to the cost competitive to get them into the system, and hopefully we will maybe be seeing some of those come online in the late 2020s, 2030s. On fracking, I think a more interesting kind of way to take this question is perhaps, should the Conservatives really be seen to be going big on fracking? I don't think so. I think it is electorally divisive. I think it would lose you votes, particularly in the key swing seats that decide elections and always will decide elections. I don't think there's much support from Conservative MPs who sit in those sorts of seats, and the support tends to come from MPs who probably won't be affected by it in their constituencies. So, you know, there is sort of a small part of me that would actually like to say, go on, try and do some fracking. If companies want to invest in it, by all means do. I don't think very many will. I don't think we'll get any, the amount of gas out that some people suggest we might be able to get out. I don't think that's at all imaginable. So I think it's going to be a failure if indeed anybody ever wants to try and get the industry going again. But if you want to engage in that failure, then companies should be allowed to do that. But coming back to the Conservative, I think they'd be silly to invest too much political capital into it. Much better to try and do some work on onshore wind and solar regulations and things like that.
Thank you. Bernice.
Yeah, can I kind of pick up on the technology point and then the territorial emissions? About a decade ago, for my sins, I did a huge study which looked at 60,000 patents. And in fact, I think I'm pretty sure that I was lobbying the FT at the time on the coverage, which they did do, which was that if you look at these patents that have been filed, or patents that have been filed around the world in these clean energy technology, the incentives for innovation or invention is not the same as diffusion. And the problem is indeed that what we really want is not only to be able to invent and be innovative, but also to be able to capture the benefit, but at the same time, being able to roll them out as fast as possible. The problem is that things like wind, and I'm sure my colleagues over there on my right could correct me, is that for a long time is an owner-operating model that benefits in some ways, that brings enormous amount of benefits, which also doesn't really lend itself to scale economics in the same way that solar did, which was indeed that, you know, basically you have technologies invented in Australia, money from California, manufacturing in China, incentive system provided by Germany and Spain, by the way, certainly in Germany where there was no sun, which actually ended up having a solar revolution, which means that it is now 9-10 times cheaper. So in some sense, the balance is quite tricky, but at the same time, it's not beyond our wits to figure out a way to make sure that we have the business model innovation that can deliver all the benefits, including those of leadership and benefits for local communities and others at the same time. So I think that being able to get our head around some of these challenges will indeed be some of the key part for our taking technological leadership, looking to the future. And to the territorial emissions, I kind of feel that the energy crisis right now, hopefully, is creating the space for thinking much more about consumption-based, you know, demand-side measures. And we know that the system is about production-based emissions reduction, about what you produce as opposed to what you use. And again, I'm going to look at this as an opportunity, therefore, that if the world is really falling behind in terms of understanding what that really means to do, I mean, we talk about blockchain like it is the solution to everything for a long time. And indeed, we have to move into where we have more traceable accountability and more accountable traceability when it comes to emissions reductions. And I think this may be an opportunity for those here and elsewhere to really think through what reducing demand side, you know, improving demand side incentives would be. So I think that I'd like to think of this as not a problem, but an opportunity for us all to put our head together and figure out how best to use the technology and provide the system that can really provide the kind of measurement that genuinely enable the kind of citizen participation that Lou just talked about as well, that individuals can feel that they play a part of it and not just being a cog in the wheel, that emissions reduction being really far from where we are today.
Thank you. I'll take another round of questions. The gentleman at the front here, please.
Richard O'Connell, President, Totnes Conservative Association. Just going off on a slight tangent, should we be looking more at recycling? Because I come from a recycling background of 45 years. We did truck tires, and every truck tire we recycled saved 68 litres of oil and 44 kilograms of rubber compound. We supplied the 3 major supermarkets in the UK who all ran on recycled tires. The aviation industry runs on retreaded tires, basically. But the government looks on recycling. When we went to get grants, etc., they say, you're not a manufacturer, you're a service industry, you don't get a grant. We had to pay 100% of the climate change levy, whereas we made new tires, we'd only pay 5% of the climate change levy. So it seems as though we all say, yes, recycling is great, but we don't really get the support.
Thank you. And yet the lady who definitely is wearing a blue top.
Correct. Hi, I'm Grace DaCosta from Quakers in Britain. Do the panel agree that, as well as to be world leaders in tackling climate change, we not only have to get our UK house in order, but also fulfil our commitments and our responsibilities to people around the world, poorest people who are suffering the worst effects of climate change despite having done the least to cause it? And that means providing finance not only for adaptation and mitigation, but also for loss and damage.
Thank you. And the gentleman standing up at the back there.
Thank you. My name is Dr. Vivek. I come from Oxford. A question to all the panel is, I'm a bit concerned about, the manufacturing in the Western world has evaporated. Everything is gone to China or other countries. How do we bring these things back? Apart from Germany, rest of the manufacturing, how will the West survive? You can't be sitting in a committee and giving rules to the whole world when your manufacturing has gone abroad. And those people who you are going to get manufactured, they have no, they use child labor, COVID things, they have no rules and regulation. So how to bring the, I come from India. And in my days, made in Germany, made in America, made in England used to be the final product. There would be never any zero defect things. So how do we bring these manufacturing back? We can't just be printing money and surviving. It won't last long, but I just want the panel to really look into it.
Thank you. I'll turn to Julian first on this one. Maybe you'd like to take that point at the end there about offshoring manufacturing, and then I don't know if recycling falls particularly into your remit, but the gentleman's question there as well.
It did in a previous slide, so I'll maybe come on to that in a second. So just very quickly on the points around drawing manufacturing back to the UK and nearshoring or friendshoring as it's getting called, I think there's a very strong argument for that. And we've seen that very clearly during COVID. We also saw it during the supply chain crisis of just how how global the supply chain is. If you've got an issue in let's say Long Beach in the States and a ship gets delayed for 10 days getting into the port, it had an impact ultimately on what was happening in the global supply chain of ships and hitting the UK. So I think it's a very strong argument from supply chain security. I think the other fascinating thing, and this is where UK government will need to grasp the nettle, is the steel industry is a good example of this, where they need to obviously drive or support the industry in terms of decarbonisation, because when we talk about Scope 3, there's absolutely no benefit in seeing the UK steel manufacturing going under, and then we just import steel from other countries, because that fundamentally undermines both manufacturing in the UK, jobs in the UK, but also our environmental ambition to reduce the footprint. So I think there's very strong arguments. I think legislation is a key part of that, and there's a lot that UK government can do to support that, and regulation that goes with it. Obviously, slightly two different things. Just on the recycling point, so in a previous slide, I did work for a business that had a recycling arm. I think there's a very, very strong argument, and I certainly lobbied at the time for greater support for that. There's obviously the waste hierarchy, which is reduce, reuse, recycle, and then capture the energy from it. But fundamentally, we can't just go on manufacturing more and more. And something like a tyre that does take hydrocarbons to produce and contains hydrocarbons has latent value going forward. Now, technology is critical in terms of releasing that energy that's captured in that tar. So I think there's a strong, there's a very strong case for doing that. And I'm certainly a strong advocate from that previous life. Again, support from government is critical, and that targeted support will help with that. I was going to make just a very quick point about a lot of the discussion that we're having today, and we've touched on this. The whole credibility issue is fundamental as well. If the UK proves that it can do it in the UK, there's a very strong argument and leadership benefit that will come from that on a global basis. So, that advocacy point, that credibility point is very, very important.
Thank you, Eamonn. I don't know if there's particular things you wanted to pick up.
Yeah, I think it's always a bit boring when everybody agrees with each other on a panel. So in the interest of having a bit of fun, I'd like to inject a little bit of division.
Please do.
I think a lot of recycling is just complete nonsense, and particularly like domestic household recycling. I think things like maybe metal cans, glass bottles perhaps, but a lot of it's one of the single best things you can read on the internet is a blog by a guy called Robert Wiblin. If you put that and recycling into Google, I'm sure it would be the first thing that comes up. But that's quite a good blog. I would really recommend it. Perhaps some things like industry-specific schemes I could maybe see the merit of, and yeah, certainly more difficult to extract minerals perhaps. But yeah, a real big bugbear of mine, and I think maybe on a more pertinent point that if people think that we can address really significant environmental questions by recycling little scraps of plastic, then we are not going to fix those problems.
I will just interject at this point to say that if anyone is interested in recycling, we've got a whole panel dedicated exactly to that very question and how the UK can lead tomorrow at what time, team, have we? It'll be on your leaflet.
Can't remember.
Well,
have a look on the leaflets.
We'll say 11 till 12 tomorrow in this very room, so please do join us if that's a particular interest. Louie, on to you next.
Okay, so to make this more interesting again, as an MP of the borough that is proudly the top London recycler for the past 17 years, I will add, and a very passionate advocate of recycling, I would disagree with you respectfully, but I think you're right. It's only part of the picture, isn't it, in terms of we're looking at kind of consumption and obviously the use of materials, natural materials, and obviously the impact of plastic pollution, for example, in the oceans. So it's part of the story, not all of it. Touching on and trying to link the first and third question, I think something I'm very passionate about, and it's something that comes up in conversations in manufacturers in my patch and others, is around this kind of national standards for recycling. I think this is a big issue where you can move effectively from one borough or area to another, and the standards of recycling are very different, and they recycle different goods, etc. So I think that's something I think government is looking at. Obviously, we've had various conversations around, deposit return schemes that are obviously very popular in parts of the Nordics and so on. So I think there's a lot of good work going on in this space, but obviously a lot more to be done. Touching on manufacturing in Britain, and the gentleman's question at the back, I get very passionate when people say we don't make things in the UK anymore. And a couple of statistics that one of the trade bodies put out is that actually Britain is actually the 9th in the world for manufacturing. It contributes around 183 billion, I think, in 2022 to the economy, and supports 2.5 million jobs. So whilst I get the point, particularly around solar panels and what's happened in the industry, and particularly in renewables, I think we mustn't lose sight that Britain is still full of great manufacturing businesses and people that have those expertise and skills, and we shouldn't be afraid to shout about it as loudly as possible. The second question I put, was it Quakers in Britain, the question come from? I do love the Quakers, I must admit. So, most of the funds in the city have strong links to the Quakers, and people forget the history of kind of the ethical and responsible investment movement in the city. A lot of it have strong links to Quakers and other religious bodies beforehand. So I think it's a really good point. I think if you look at the point around the UK supporting those most vulnerable in the world, which your question to climate change, I think the international climate finance and the funding that the government's been doing is a real positive story, linking that aid to climate. So the expenditure of finance from the government was doubled to 11.6 billion for the next 5 years, so between April 2021 and 2026. And over the last 10 years up to 2021, UK aid was estimated to have supported 88 million people from climate change issues and impacts. So I think the UK has done a lot, but obviously will continue to do a leading role and linking the aid to supporting those most vulnerable to climate change.
Thank you, Louie. And Bernice, maybe I'll bring you in on that question as well, because I think aid and climate finance has been the intractable issue of so many recent COPs. So interested in your take on that.
Well, I mean, I think the lady mentioned loss and damage, and indeed that it will look like to be one of the main issues this year in the COP. We'll see how it pans out, and at least we are now talking about it. Let's start with that. On a sort of more specific and practical note about UK aid, it is quite clear that if we could use limited amount of money, which is limited everywhere really, to do as much as we can on all the objectives that we have, which is including, for example, securing climate security, investing in the future, investing in green supply chains and manufacturing hubs in here and elsewhere, that would always be the best. So of course I'm going to make a play for making sure that we are using the amount of resources we still have in this area on climate investment in helping to facilitate, work together with others on sustainable, better, safer, cleaner, greener, cheaper green supply chains around the world. And that would indeed be one way, among others, especially if we could have a nature positive agenda to go along with that as well, so that we're not forgetting that nature could be indeed the cushion that enable resilience, and that, you know, there's no way of us meeting our objective and agenda without making sure that we are protecting intact forests elsewhere and having carbon sinks as well. So I think that to be able to use the resources we do have to help facilitate and enable these with others with the similar kind of resources will be a very important way for us to use the resources we do have when it comes to international investments and aid.
Brilliant, thank you. We've got about 8 minutes left, so if there are further questions, I will try and take a couple. The gentleman and the lady at the front here, thank you.
Thank you, Peter Coniford from Vitek Associates. UK government has lobbied long and hard through the Ministry of Defence and Department of Defence and the federal US government to enable us to actually bid into and deliver into the US military, which took a long time. It is now super successful. So BAE Systems is actually upgrading, maintaining, delivering on major components of the US military force. Rolls-Royce, in the last 2 weeks, has just concluded a contract to deliver engines for the B-52 strategic bomber. Which bit of the UK government and which bit of the US government need to get together for the same thing to happen in terms of renewables?
Thank you, and then just...
Hi, Vicky from Zoological Society of London. So we provide a lot of the technical information and data across UNFCCC, CITES and Convention of Biological Diversity, and obviously all those COPs are happening in sort of 5 weeks towards the end of the year, so it's a very busy time for us, and these discussions are not just taking place within the kind of the actual COP events, they are throughout the year. So how do we make sure that our scientists and our businesses and governments are not getting fatigued and maintaining that leadership role, because it is a great draw of manpower and brain power for everybody.
Thank you. Louie, I might come to you first on either of those. I'm going to implore the panellists to help me achieve my mission of finishing top of the Sen League table for finishing an event on time. So, but yeah, please.
Well, I think on the first question around the US, like I said earlier in my earlier comments, it's fascinating how much doors are open in the US that weren't previously, particularly around renewables and the environment. I suspect it's probably something for Department for International Trade, BEIS, to be getting stuck into with the new ministers there, and I know looking at the longer-term US trade deal with the UK, I'm sure that's something that there's opportunities, as always, in certain areas of international trade for opportunity there, and I'm sure that's something I can take back to colleagues quite happily to do that. And then the second point about kind of, I suppose I'd describe it as the crowding out effect, isn't it? It's the drain on brain power. I think it's an interesting point. I think you're right to raise it, and I think, as always, it's looking at prioritising kind of the big challenges and the big achievements that we can deliver and focus on outcomes rather than just, one of the biggest frustrations I've had over the years engaging with various public sector entities is kind of meetings for meetings' sake and, not actually looking at outcomes. And I think I would say from a policy point of view and from a practical point of view, we have to focus on what are those key strategic outcomes that we want to achieve from all of these kind of international various organisations and meeting and focus on those, because otherwise I think you just get the crowding out effect, focus on different issues at once, and it just drains brain power, which I think can impact all of us, not just at conference.
I think you speak for the whole room when you say we'd like to not have meetings for meetings' sake. Julian, perhaps I'll come to you next.
Yeah, no, just so if I start with the renewables question, I think I can sort of come to it from the angle of business. As I said, we've, there are fellow port operating companies in the States, and, we share information and experience with them. And that's also through at a shareholder level as well as an operating company level. From a government department perspective, I think it probably is DIT and BEIS. Obviously, DFT work with ports very closely. So where ministers or civil servants are speaking to their counterparties, it's making sure that opportunity is realised. And that there is opportunity there. And I think it's just on that final point. I think, you know, as Louie was saying, it's a question we ask ourselves, or, you know, on a daily basis, probably everybody in this room. And I think this is going to be one of the challenges for this government. Actually, we've got 2 years potentially till the next election. The messaging is around deliver, 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 and therefore, you know, government needs to be very clear on what it wants to focus on, rather than you know, going too broad. So it is that prioritisation point, which I think is critical. But yes, I certainly feel your pain when it comes to, you know, a crux of meetings coming and a crux of events happening later on in the year. It certainly challenges everything.
Thank you, Bernice.
I was just thinking that being able to deliver solutions and leadership is energizing. So I don't really know how to prescribe self-care that I am really bad at myself. But nonetheless, I would think that the energizing point is indeed to deliver solutions. And that would be one way of keeping ourselves energized, I guess.
Absolutely. Eamonn, anything to add?
I don't think so, no.
Okay, brilliant. Well, we're almost out of time. I'm going to ask, instead of filling full closing remarks, I'm going to ask the panel, maybe in 1-2 sentences maximum each, if they could say what they think the one thing the UK can most contribute to the global fight on climate change. Maybe I'll start with Bernice and go along the panel.
I think that making sure that we are capturing the opportunities from our science superpowerdom and our perfectly sized trading nation status to perpetuate, obviously, and build these supply chains I was talking about together with others.
Brilliant. Louie?
I think there's a couple of things. I think there's certainly leading the way in terms of decarbonising. I think we've been one of the fastest, certainly in the G20, in doing so. So we've got a proven track record of doing that. And we've proven leadership, for example. But I think now it's providing that leadership, not just from a moral point of view, but from an economic opportunities of sharing expertise and knowledge, particularly in the renewable sectors and others, to lead the world in the fight against climate change.
Yeah, I think I echo those sentiments. Speaking from my own experience working with Alok, through him, I think the UK accumulated an enormous degree of political capital on the international scene for climate diplomacy and further climate action, and indeed countries have done more because of the UK's presidency of COP26. Everybody in the room will know that there's been discussions about whether climate will take maybe a back seat in this new government, and I think it would be an enormous mistake for that to be allowed to happen. And I hope that groups like SEN ensure that doesn't happen.
We'll certainly be doing our best. Julian?
So just, yeah, very finally, I think the points I would make is, you know, the key thing is about investing in the UK, so proving that technology works at scale. And then that's something that's transferable on a global basis. So focus on the UK, prove that it works in the UK, and then export it.
Brilliant. Well, thank you all very much. We are pretty much out of time. Our next event will be in here at 6:30 on how the UK can make sure we are reaching net zero whilst growing the economy. A very topical decision for that, and then we will be joined by the Climate Change Minister Graham Stewart for that, and another fantastic panel. Thank you to all of the panellists for this panel. You've contributed to a fascinating discussion. Thank you all for coming. Please do, if you haven't already, sign up as a SEN supporter. It's well worth it, and it doesn't cost you a penny. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, everyone.